Hello, learners, and welcome to the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, I introduced the concept of reverse colonization and I gave the example of H. Rider Haggard's novel She. Another very powerful instance of what reverse colonization was and how Victorian writers responded to this widespread anxiety can be found in the 1898 novel The War of the Worlds, this one by H.G. Wells. This is a novel in which England is invaded by Martians, who are also referred to as Morlocks. These characters, Martians, are described by other characters in terms that highlight their racial difference, and not just difference, but their racial inferiority. Several characters describe the Martians by pointing to their lack of hygiene, their primitivism, and their inferior race in general. Now, the context in which this novel was written also refers to ideas of colonization. The novel was written when the author, H.G. Wells, was discussing a particular event, a particularly controversial historical event. This event was the extermination of the indigenous Tasmanians by Western, chiefly British, forces. And this thought, the thought that white British people were incredibly powerful and they used that power to inflict violence on other people, people from different races who did not have access to the kinds of weaponry or military or technological sophistication as these white British Western forces did, produced a lot of thoughts in the minds of this author. And we can see these thoughts reflected in the way events unfold in the novel The War of the Worlds. Two key ideas are worth noting. The first is that Martians in this novel are frequently referred to as brutes and as inferior races. These were words that were used in the media of the time, in journalism, as well as scholarly and non-fictional writing, to refer to the way imperial nations, and particularly Britain, treated indigenous people in other parts of the world. It's also worth noting that in the War of the Worlds, England is in the place of the colonized, and Martians, that is, outsiders, are in the role of the colonizer. And further, the novel also speculates about the reason why Martians have the upper hand and why Martians are in the position and are wanting to be in this position where they can attack, assault, and otherwise create problems for British people. That reason the novel ventures to offer is that because we, that is, Englishmen, have been violent towards other people. And so this is, in a way, justified suffering, that they have earned this suffering by inflicting violence themselves. On whom the novel refers to these innocent sufferers as the poor brutes we dominate. That is, we here refers to England. And the writer is saying that just as Englishmen have dominated poor brutes, Englishmen are converted into poor brutes when Martians invade England. Further, the character and the narrator refers to wars of extermination that were waged by England on foreign soil. And as a consequence and as a way of explaining this cause for violence, one of the first buildings to be destroyed in the novel is the Oriental College, a powerful symbol of the Western appropriation of Eastern knowledge and culture. Some key phrases from the novel are worth noting, which help us understand exactly how this reverse colonization as a fear is demonstrated in the novel. The Martians in Wells's novel are referred to as primitive savages. Other adjectives and derogatory language that is used to describe these Martians include dark, oily, unclean, inarticulate, sexually perverse, and cannibalistic. Further, these Martians are described as unspeakably nasty, and at one moment a character describes these Martians as ugly brutes. Now, earlier in this course, I have referred to the work of Edward Said, and I have explicated the theory of Orientalism, which lays down a binary opposition between attributes that European scholars and Western writers attributed to an Occidental identity and opposing traits which were created to describe the figure of the Orient. Now, these features included masculinity, included rationality, included a normal sexuality, and other norms of civilization. And it was understood that the Orient was in the inferior side of all of these binaries. So we can see in H.G. Wells's description of the Martians that these Orientalist norms are very powerfully at work. In addition to these Orientalist norms, there are also some ideas of primitivism and virility which are quite central to narratives like H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. These ideas of primitivism are articulated by a character in the novel who happens to be the artilleryman of Putney Hill. This is a character who expresses a very complex idea. First, it is articulated that people in England are enervated. That is, they are a fallen or diseased and corrupted race of people. This is a race of people that has been brought low from a very high position. It is not known exactly why this fall has occurred, but it is clear that there was once a time when English people were doing much better. Today, however, they have lost a lot of virility, health, and a general sense of biological well-being. That sense of biological well-being is no longer there, and England is now a fallen or diseased race. Such a fallen or diseased race would in fact welcome its own cleansing by a superior race. This is a very complex idea, and yet this idea is articulated by a character, an English character in H.G. Wells's novel, The War of the Worlds. The phrase that this character uses to describe this fallen, diseased race of English people is miserable skedaddle. Now, in addition to these two novels, there are two other types of novels which also helped strengthen this fear of reverse colonization, which was very prevalent in the writing of the late Victorian period. These two categories of novels were respectively the dynamite novel and novels that frequently wrote about the invasion scare. In both of these categories of novels, we find that writers described in great detail fears of social unrest that would be produced in England by either foreigners or by criminal elements who happen to come from the lower strata of Victorian society. Both of these types of tendencies are very powerfully found to animate Bram Stoker's Dracula. Another key tendency of the 19th century and a key category, key style of writing in the 18th and 19th centuries in English literature, and which very powerfully animates Bram Stoker's Dracula, is the tradition of the Gothic novel. Now, earlier Gothic novels had certain features. They were set in foreign locales, these foreign countries, that is, castles in Germany or in other European nations, in continental Europe, in which one English protagonist has somehow traveled and through a strange series of circumstances has somehow been trapped in this foreign Gothic locale. This generally tends to be the plot of most Gothic novels that were written earlier in the century. Coming to the last decade of the Victorian period, however, we find that there is a key shift in this very typical narrative of the Gothic. The Gothic in this period comes home to England. In scholarship on the Gothic, writers have tended to swing from universal concerns about human identity to political concerns. And it's important to note that in the way the Gothic is referenced in Dracula, the political concerns of thinking about the Gothic are most powerfully present. That is, concerns about the future of England, concerns about the fate of the English race, fears about the longevity of the British Empire. These were all political concerns which were channeled through the genre of the Gothic and they were made powerful, they were made accessible to readers of popular fiction through a work like Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, the Count, the figure of the Count Dracula, who is referred to in popular parlance as Dracula, represents a lot of these primitive forces that threaten to overturn the scientific, rational, progressive, and civilized world of Victorian England. So, this is a form of reverse colonization which the novel is deeply preoccupied with. The narrator is deeply fearful that reverse colonization will take place, and this fear is demonstrated through the character of the Count Dracula and how he proceeds to go about his plan to colonize England. Dracula's plan to colonize England is to infect English people by biting them or by drawing their blood. And when he does that, the people who are attacked by the Count turn into vampires in their own right. That is, they start to form an army of other infected vampiric human beings. And this leads to a fear of reverse colonization, that England will become a different kind of space, that not only the biology, that is the blood, not only will the blood of English people who are bitten or attacked by the vampire will change, but also their racial, political, social, and cultural identity. This is how Bram Stoker combines this very popular Gothic story of a vampire with political and contemporary concerns about reverse colonization. The last form of convention or trope that Bram Stoker's novel deals with and uses is that of the travel narrative. This was a very popular form of writing in late Victorian England, and it is very crucial to understanding how Dracula, as a powerful narrative, produces its persuasion and remains persuasive even today. The novel begins when Jonathan Harker is traveling. He's writing diaries while he's sitting on a train, and the train is going eastward from London towards Eastern Europe. And while he's sitting on the train, Jonathan Harker describes experiencing different cultural, culinary, social, and human conventions that he is not familiar with, but which he finds incredibly fascinating. A lot of these conventions he also presumes to pronounce judgment on. Conventions such as the kind of food that people eat in Romania, the way people behave, the way human beings interact with each other, the way men and women relate to each other. So there's a great deal of the Orientalist traveler, the scientific observer, who is observing things and jumping to very quick conclusions, some not very scientific, but based solely on his authority as that of an observer. The Gothic and the travel narrative combined together allow Bram Stoker to question many boundaries between the civilized and the primitive, the colonizer and the colonized, and the victimizer and the victim. These are the boundaries that helped give Victorian England a sense of its own identity as a powerful, rational, and very stable and very sane self. The novel, however, disrupts that sense of security, disrupts that sense of stability. And it is through the figure of Count Dracula that this destabilization is produced. Now, the novel also then, in the second half, goes about controlling this disruption and demonstrates exactly how this force can be brought under control, how this insurrection can be brought under control. However, this controlling effort is less successful than it at first appears, and we will understand that by close reading some sentences from the ending of the novel later. But first, let us understand the reverse colonization and the spaces outside England which serve as the origin of this reverse colonization. The place in which Bram Stoker situates his novel Dracula is Transylvania. The standard Victorian work on the region was Charles Bonner's book, Transylvania, which was published in the year 1865, and it is a classic Victorian document which seeks to analyze foreign places by pronouncing judgments on their racial makeup. This book, Bonner's Transylvania, begins by marveling at the spectacle of variety, and this is how Bonner writes. The diversity of character which the various physiognomies present, that meet you at every step, also tell of the many nations which are here brought together. The slim, lithe Hungarian, the more oriental Wallachian, with softer, sensuous air, in her style of dress and even in her carriage, unlike a dweller in the West, a Moldavian princess wrapped in a Turkish shawl, now a Serb marches proudly past, his countenance calm as a Turk's, or a Constantinople merchant sweeps along in his loose robes and snowy turban. There are too Greeks, Dalmatians, and Croats, all different in feature. There is no end to the variety. So we can see that the Victorian view of Transylvania was that of a place where there was a great deal of racial diversity. This racial diversity is seen in a very ambiguous manner. It is neither a straightforward evil or impure thing, but it is not something that is to be praised. It is something that is incredibly fascinating to a Victorian observer. It is something that has the potential for a great deal of harm, even though that harm may or may not be realized in all cases. Bram Stoker's drafts for Dracula moved from one location to another. In the early drafts, while Stoker was finalizing the novel, he had set the castle in a land he called Styria. Styria was another name for Austria, and in this, Bram Stoker was following Le Fanu, a contemporary Irish writer who wrote the novel Carmilla. In the final version of Dracula, however, the location had changed from Styria to Transylvania. This change is an important one, and it speaks to how connected Bram Stoker was to contemporary late Victorian debates about politics, race, and empire. In the 1880s and 1890s, Transylvania was the subject of a great deal of political debate. Much writing in the newspapers of the time, as well as scholarly work in the time, focused on what was known as the Eastern Question. This Eastern Question referred to the place of Turkey and how the racial and cultural dynamic of Turkey could play a very important role in the future of the British Empire. In Stoker's novel, the Gothic becomes linked to the political questions of the rise and fall of empires, as well as the racial question of the superiority and the inferiority of the British Empire, and how the British Empire could sustain the conflicts between white British races and other spaces in which several other races lived together. And this can be understood in how one character, Van Helsing, describes Count Dracula, who by this point in the novel is established as the primary villain. Van Helsing describes Dracula in these words: "He have followed the wake of the Berserker Icelander, the devil-begotten Hun, the Slav, the Saxon, the Magyar." So there are at least 5 or 6 nationalities and races combined in this figure. And it is this racial diversity which itself becomes the definition of everything that is evil in Dracula. While a discussion of geopolitics and the history and the geography of Eastern Europe is certainly very important to understanding the particular affect and the force of the horror in the novel Dracula, it's also important to consider sexuality and its repression, as well as the whole structures of feeling attached to secrets and their revelation, in order to understand the particular shape and feel and tone of horror in the novel Dracula. In one of my earlier lectures, I had referred to sexuality, its repression, as well as the different ways of managing secrets that Bram Stoker had evolved in his career. And I will now briefly return to that discussion to conclude our study of the novel Dracula. I will refer to events from Bram Stoker's biographical existence, as well as some key moments from the novel Dracula, to help explain how both politics as well as psychology, insofar as it affects sexuality, are equally important and determinative themes when we try to understand this very powerful and influential novel, Dracula by Bram Stoker. So, the way the novel Dracula describes horror and monstrosity is actually a strategy, or can be understood as a strategy, by which Bram Stoker dealt with, or indeed coped with, many of the potentially stress inducing events and constraints of his time. One may begin with the fact that Bram Stoker began writing Dracula a month after Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency. That is, he was punished by the state for an expression of homosexuality. Now, prior to this event, Bram Stoker and Oscar Wilde were known to each other. They were not strangers. In fact, they had a very deeply fraught relationship. It could be called a friendship from the surface, but there were deep tensions embedded in it. They had known each other for at least 20 years, and the feelings that Oscar Wilde's conviction produced in Bram Stoker can be understood in the way Stoker describes horror in Dracula. Specifically, the kind of horror the novel describes also allows us to note the feelings which Stoker allowed himself to articulate in public, and those feelings which he did not allow himself to articulate, which he supposedly suppressed, but these suppressed feelings found themselves articulated in Dracula. These feelings have essentially two forms. On one hand, there is the fear of being exposed, shamed, punished, and treated very, very unfairly simply for being who one is. And this, we can understand, would be a very natural fear for a person who had sympathized with publicly out homosexual writers like Walt Whitman, and who had secretly sympathized with writers who were being publicly accused of indecency like Oscar Wilde. Bram Stoker was one such writer. He had written letters expressing deep sympathy with Walt Whitman, and he had secretly watched Oscar Wilde being humiliated, punished, and generally treated very poorly. So the fear of being exposed, shamed, and punished for being who one is, not for committing a crime, but simply of being treated as a criminal for simply existing. This is a very real fear. It existed in a very powerful way for Bram Stoker, and yet it was a fear that Stoker was not able to articulate publicly. This is one very powerful feeling around which the structure of horror in Dracula is created. On the other hand, in addition to this fear of exposure, there's also a feeling that staying in the closet, right, that is, living in fear, living without being detected, hiding, that state of existence, a state of perpetual fear, may not be such a bad thing. That is to say, even though one is forced to live in a state of perpetual fear, this state may be managed in a satisfactory way. This is a somewhat contradictory feeling, and yet this was a feeling that Stoker had grown slowly by degrees to have. And we can see this feeling both described in greater detail in the novel Dracula. We can also see how this feeling exerts a dialectical force, exists in tension with the other feeling, which is a more simplistic fear of exposure. And it is the tension between these two feelings, the fear of exposure and a growing certainty that living in fear may be a satisfactory thing to do. It is the tension between these two feelings that can best help us understand the particular tone and structure of fear in Dracula. So, in the first section of the novel, we see that there is a perpetual fear, right? And in the second, we see that there is a hope for happiness, right? These two states, these two emotional states are sharply different. And yet, both of these states are produced from the same set of feelings, the same set of contradictory feelings that Stoker developed in the wake of Oscar Wilde's trial and in the state of feeling those very contradictory, fearful thoughts that Stoker experienced. And this is reflected very directly in the plot of the novel Dracula. In the beginning, Jonathan Harker is trapped in Dracula's castle. Right? This part refers more or less allegorically to the fear of exposure, to the dread of being punished not for committing a crime, but simply for existing. In the second half of the novel, things change quite dramatically. Harker has amassed a band of brothers, a group of men who all support each other. He is quite intimate and trusts these men. He also has a bourgeois family, that is, he's married and he has a child as well. This state produces not discomfort, shame, or fear, but rather it produces pleasure. Harker is quite satisfied. Harker has managed the fear he had experienced in Castle Dracula through the friendship, through the support, and through the particular relationship that he has with his wife, that is Mina. These two states, trapped, fearful in Dracula's castle, and second, empowered, supported by a band of brothers, intimate, trustworthy male friends. Right? These two states describe Bram Stoker's particular attitude towards the closet, fear of being exposed as homosexual, and growing satisfaction that the state of hiding, that the state of secrecy which he had managed to create for himself would be quite satisfactory. There is also something that is less visible to readers, but discerning readers and scholarly readers can note, which is that these two states that Jonathan Harker experiences in the novel are actually not that different. Right? We are made to believe that they are different, and this certainly drives the narrative engine of the novel. This is the propulsive force that keeps us reading, because we are very curious to know how Harker is going to overcome the trouble, overcome the hardships, and become and sort of avenge the wrongs that were done to him. But if we look closely, we will notice that by the time Harker succeeds in removing this evil that Dracula is, Harker has become a lot like Dracula. He's quite violent, he's quite bloodthirsty, and more importantly, he has a renewed appreciation of sexuality, particularly as it concerns the exchange of bodily fluids. Now, we don't have time to go into exactly what kind of bodily fluids are exchanged. Those who've read the novel will know exactly what I'm talking about. But blood, the exchange of blood, and the easy justification of certain forms of blood being exchanged as safe and good, and certain other forms of blood being exchanged as evil. Right? This is a very thinly veiled metaphor for sexuality. And if one notices how all the men come together and how the women are objects in this exchange of power that men are perpetually transacting, one can understand that there is a great deal of messaging. There's a great deal of code being exchanged in this novel. Two essays by Stoker represent this radically different approach to secrecy, which I had mentioned in an earlier lecture. The first of these essays was published in the year 1908 and was titled The Censorship of Fiction. And the very next year, 1909, Stoker published another essay titled The Censorship of Stage Plays. In both these pieces, Stoker makes two key points. First, there is a need for repression of certain impulses to act in indecent ways or describe such actions. Second, Stoker also argues that such repression needs to be practiced by the state or the government because individuals do not practice discretion. In other words, individuals, and this is certainly code for Oscar Wilde, do not self-censor effectively or thoroughly enough. And because individuals do not self-censor effectively, states must censor. Right? A particularly sophisticated, creative, and effective example of such discretion, such self-censorship, can be located in the novel Dracula. The trial of Oscar Wilde challenged Bram Stoker's established channels for regulating and managing his desires. As a closeted homosexual, Bram Stoker had managed his desires in three ways. First, he had found pleasure in receiving other men's texts. Whitman, but not only Whitman. That is to say, he had displaced his libidinal pleasures from acts of physical intimacy to intellectual production, that is, the reading and writing of texts. Second, Stoker had triangulated desire through women, that is, turning himself and other women into rivals. And another brief fact to note is that Oscar Wilde was dating and almost married Florence, who eventually married Bram Stoker. And third, Stoker had managed and regulated his sexuality through the enjoyment of narratives of other people's intense experiences. Now, the trial of Oscar Wilde challenged all three of these modes of regulation because, on one hand, many close friends and family members sympathized, both in public and in private, to varying degrees, with the dreadful plight that Oscar Wilde, a common friend, was going through. In response to these, Stoker felt intense private sympathy, and we can conclude this based on the remaining written and textual evidence in Stoker's archive. We can conclude from what Stoker has left in writing that Stoker felt intense private sympathy towards Oscar Wilde and the dreadful plight that he was going through. However, Stoker was also deeply invested in his public persona and his reputation, that he was actually rendered powerless to do anything in public to express these feelings. That is to say, Stoker felt a stronger pressure to exert discretion than to express himself in public. It is the result of these two contradictory feelings: great sympathy on one hand, and intense pressure to be discreet, to not express that sympathy, that can be said to result in the novel Dracula. Two characters, Jonathan Harker and Count Dracula, represent Oscar Wilde in two ways. That is to say, they represent one of these, that is Count Dracula. Count Dracula represents Oscar Wilde as he was vilified in the British newspapers of the time. That is, Oscar Wilde was presented in the popular sensational media as a seducer, as someone who would corrupt young men and boys, and effectively a monster who was raging in British society of the time. Jonathan Harker, on the other hand, represents Oscar Wilde as a human being, and this is Oscar Wilde as Bram Stoker would have known Oscar Wilde to be. Not a monster, but quite the opposite. In fact, an innocent writer imprisoned and punished for no fault other than simply existing, other than being himself. There is a brief list I would like to provide while I conclude of some textual details that connect Oscar Wilde's trial with Stoker's novel Dracula. Dracula is a creature that stinks. This is the perception that most characters have in the novel. Dracula, Count Dracula, smells of decay, putrefaction, and death. Several writers had used this kind of language describing Oscar Wilde himself and/or individuals associated with him. Homosexuals were described as unclean and monstrous, and Count Dracula is a character who signals all of those qualities. In the novel, the three Englishmen, that is Arthur Holmwood, Jack Seward, and Jonathan Harker, clean Dracula's coffin and use the term purification to describe their actions. Count Dracula becomes an allegorical representation of Oscar Wilde, not as Wilde was, but as Wilde was frequently described in contemporary newspaper and journalistic accounts. The qualities that these two share are that they are both supposedly creatures of the night, that is, they live alone, and they do not employ cleaners or servants, due to which their quarters are frequently in various states of disrepair. And the supposed reason for the lack of cleaners or servants in their houses is that they fear being detected or exposed as homosexual. Another feature that links both Count Dracula and Oscar Wilde is that people fear them because they think that these are characters who will seduce and corrupt other gullible young men. Jonathan Harker represents both Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker. In the first half of the novel, Harker is imprisoned in the Count's castle, like Wilde was imprisoned by the state. In the second half of the novel, Harker takes on the powers of that which he earlier feared, that is, Count Dracula. Stoker is like this in that by the time the novel appeared in print, he was able to make a public and authoritative case against certain indecent forms of horror. That is to say, in the way that the novel empowers Jonathan Harker, Stoker presents a version of himself. Stoker has empowered himself by writing the novel Dracula to be able to say certain things that he was otherwise fearful of, discreet enough, or just unwilling to say in public. So the empowerment of Jonathan Harker is also the empowerment of Bram Stoker. But in both cases, this empowerment comes at a very heavy price. Stoker was able to take on the position of the same state that punished Oscar Wilde. As I mentioned in my earlier lecture, in the 1870s, Stoker had feared the state, which would punish him if his secret was publicly known. But in the early 20th century, Stoker no longer feared the state because those secrets, those potentially problematic secrets, had been displaced onto his fiction. In the second half of the novel, Jonathan Harker inflicts righteous violence on the Count. He enters the same space, that is, the Count's castle, where he was earlier imprisoned, and this time none of the physical barriers can stop him. The Sigani army, which had intimidated Harker in the beginning to the point of paralysis, no longer exerts any fear. Further, Harker initially fears revealing to Mina the details of his confinement in the castle. Later, however, Mina reacts with enthusiasm and even a sort of affection towards this and other instances of same-sex intimacy between men in the novel. Again, there are frequent exchanges of fluid, mostly blood, and which are all justified by the quasi-scientific logic of defeating the vampire. And each of these transactions of blood is justified by the language of purification and preservation, which were again words that were frequently used in Oscar Wilde's trial. So these ideas conclude our discussion of Dracula, and I hope that it has been a useful explication of how themes of geography, geopolitics, as well as psychology and sexuality deeply influence how the novel was composed, how it was received, and how we can study it in very fruitful ways today. Thank you.